Meine sehr geschätzten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
sehr geschätzte Konferenzteilnehmer,
dear
ich
participants,
darf, weil soeben eingetroffen, sozusagen den Bundesminister Außendienst Dr.
let
Werner
me
FASSLABEnd sehr
introduce
herzlich bei uns begrüßen.
Dr. Werner
Ich darf
FASSLABEnd, our
sehr
former
herzlich
Minister
begrüßen
of
den
Defense.
Akademiekommandanten,
Let me
Herrn
also
Generalleutnant Magister Erich
welcome
Schickowitz, Herr General, sehr
Lieutenant
herzlich
General
willkommen.
Erich
Ebenfalls hier bei uns
Schickowitz, our
eingetroffen,
commandant,
Präsident der
who
Strateg,
just arrived, and the
Generalleutnant
President of Strateg, General Lieutenant
Christian Ségur-Cabanat.
Christian
Meine sehr
Ségur-Cabanach.
verehrten Konferenzteilnehmer,
Ladies and gentlemen,
diese Strategiekonferenz hat also
this year's strategy conference
sich zum Thema gestellt, Strategie und Wille.
has the
Wir haben
topic
also
strategy
schon
and will.
in den bereits erfolgten
Now in
Vorträgen
the
schon gehört
lectures
über
and presentations we
den
heard
Bereich
this
Wille
afternoon,
und seine Wirkungsmacht
we heard a lot about
in der
will and its
politisch-strategischen
power
und
in the
militärischen
political,
Sphäre,
strategic and military
die
domains,
Bedeutung des Wehrwillens für die militärische
the importance
Strategie
of the will to
mit der
fight
Fragestellung,
in military
sind
strategy, and the
die
question,
Europäer dem gewachsen?
are the Europeans up to it?
Fragezeichen.
Question mark.
Und hatten dann ein
And then
Panel
we had the
Wirtschaft,
panel
Energie
on economy,
Ressourcen
energy and
und
resources.
kommen jetzt
And now the
zum
next
nächsten Vortragenden. Es ist dies
agenda
Bundesminister
item
außer Dienst Dr.
will
Werner
be a
FASSLABEnd.
presentation
Er
given
war
by
im Zeitraum 1990
Werner
bis
FASSLABEnd, who
2000
between
Bundesminister für
1990
Landesverteidigung
and 2000
und
served
in
as
dieser
Federal Minister
Funktion
of Defense.
organisierte er im Jahre
And in this function, in
das
1998, he organized
Verteidigungsministertreffen
the
auf
first meeting
EU-Ebene.
of defense
Bundesminister
ministers on an
Dr.
EU
FASSLABEnd
level.
ist also derzeit Präsident
Dr.
des
FASSLABEnd
Austria-Instituts
nowadays
für
is president of the
Europa- und
Austrian Institute for
Sicherheitspolitik.
European and Security Policy.
Und in dieser Funktion sehr, sehr positiv für
And he has played a very positive role in this function as
aber auch im
regards
Vorfeld
discussions on
für
military
Gedanken europäischer
security
Sicherheit, sehr, sehr federführend und positiv
and
unterwegs.
European
Wir
security.
freuen uns jetzt, Herr Bundesminister, auf Ihren Vortrag zum Thema
Dear Mr.
Strategie
FASSLABEnd, we are very much looking forward
und
to
Wille
your
der
lecture
Groß- und
on the
Supermächte.
topic strategy and will of
Und,
great
ich
powers
darf,
and superpowers.
Sie sehr herzlich ersuchen, jetzt
Let
zu
me
mir
now
auf
ask
das
you
Podium zu kommen.
to come to the
Und
podium.
wir freuen uns auf Ihren Vortrag.
We are looking forward to listening
dass Sie sich die Zeit
to your
nehmen,
words. Thank you for
bei
taking
dieser Konferenz zu
time to be
Danke.
here at this conference. Thank you.
Ja, meine Herren, Generäle, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Generals,
es ist für mich
ladies and
eine
gentlemen,
große Freude,
it's a great pleasure
heute hier mit dabei zu
for me
sein.
to be here today
Und
with
es
you.
vorweg zu sagen, ich habe mir ein relativ umfangreiches
And let me
Kapitel
tell you straight
vorgenommen.
away that I have
Das heißt, ich werde nicht in die Tiefe gehen,
decided to
sondern
talk
versuchen
about quite
einfach
broad a
einen
subject. I
Überblick,
will not go into
das
detail. I will rather
meiner
give you an overview
Sicht über
of what I
die
consider
Fragestellung Strategien und,
to be the
Strategie
most
und
important
Wille bei den
aspects
Groß- und
about strategy and
Supermächten
will
Ich werde
when it comes
vorher
to
auch
great
einige
powers and superpowers.
Charts noch
I will
zeigen
start
über
by showing a few
die
charts
Veränderung der
on
gesamtstrategischen
what
Lage,
has
die mir wichtig
changed
erscheint für das
in the
bessere
area
Verständnis
of the
der
general strategic
nachfolgenden
situation, which will allow us to
nachfolgenden
better
Einzelbetrachtungen.
understand the individual
Vielleicht
points
gleich
which
in
I will
medias
touch
res
upon
zu gehen.
afterwards. Let me
Es geht
start
mir,
right away
bei
by
meinem
saying
Vortrag weniger jetzt
that
um die konkrete
in my speech
Militärstrategie,
I will
sondern eher
not so
um die
much talk
Frage der
about
Gesamtstrategie
specific
der
military
Groß- und
strategy.
Supermächte
I would
und
rather
natürlich die
talk about the
Militärstrategie
overall strategy of super and
in unterschiedlicher
major
Form
powers,
eine sehr hohe Bedeutung hat.
where of course
Ich kenne,
military strategies do
Einige
play
der österreichischen Teilnehmer
a major role to a
werden einige von
different
den
extent.
Charts
Some of the
sicherlich
Austrian
schon kennen,
participants will
aber ich
probably
hoffe,
have
Sie
seen
verzeihen mir das.
some of my
Äh,
charts. Please,
glaube,
please
dass
bear
es
with me
gut vernünftig
nevertheless.
ist,
I think
bestimmte
it is
Zusammenhänge
indeed
herzustellen.
important to
Und ich beginne das
point
Ganze
out
mit
certain
der
links
Übersicht
again and again. Let me start by giving you an overview of the changes in our global strategic landscape. We have two circles and one elliptic circle, and we're talking about the maritime center. In ancient times, this was the Mediterranean Sea, then it was the Atlantic Sea, and it will be the Indo-Pacific Sea in the 21st century. So the combination of the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific Ocean. Why is that so? There are some specific reasons for this. 50% of the world container trade and 70% of petroleum shipments take place in the Indian Ocean these days. I don't want to go into details, so let's move on to the next slide. If you look at the future, you can be sure to say that this is going to increase considerably because we have all the necessary dynamics in this area. This includes the demographic development. Let me just take one example. Southern Asia alone will have a population increase of 470 million people between now and 2050. So that's the entire population of the European Union. And then you have to add Eastern Asia, Western Asia, and of course Africa. Eastern Asia will be stagnating, by the way. Now, another consequence of this is that, not least because of demographic developments, a large part of emerging states are actually in this very area. If you take the BRICS and the next 11, as they are called, only 3 are outside of this area: Brazil, Mexico, and Nigeria. All the other states are concentrated in this large area, and this alone shows us that that's where the economic dynamics and therefore the political dynamics will take place. This brings me to the actual topic of my speech. The question of strategy in great and superpowers. What you can see here, the circles and ellipses, you can see the blue circles, Russia, the European Union, and India, and 2 red circles, America and China. The differentiation basically tells you that we only have 2 superpowers. A complete superpower, the United States, and superpower to be China, especially because the military aspect has not yet reached superpower status, but it will. And then we have 3 additional powers. Of course, I could have extended the list and included Israel, Iran, the United Kingdom, France. That's about it, more or less. But I tried to limit it to the big players to be able to give you some more details about these very few players. Let me start our discussion with China. Why do I want to start with China? Because it will be the politically changing factor in the area of great and superpowers. It will be, and it is already, to the extent that almost all the other actors, be it the United States, be it India or Europe, have already started to a considerable extent to define themselves as against China. It's not so much the case with Russia, but probably just because it's being covered in a way. But in general, everyone else is defining their role in regard to China. The map you look at is 7 years old, so any more recent developments, such as the 16 plus 1 or 18 plus 1 cannot be found on this map. But what you see very clearly is that China actually has a strong terrestrial strategy which has been in place and which had the aim to ensure a dominating position in Asia, with the exception of Russia, India, and maybe the Arab Peninsula, because of their oil resources and financial means. But China actually has won over Africa already, and it's on its way to also win large parts or take possession of large parts of South America. A strong and global strategic approach followed by China, which has not come to an end for the time being. The next map shows us the maritime lifelines of East Asia, and especially of China, as it were, because of its need, demand for raw materials and its large foreign trade. China needs to make sure that this maritime route, which goes across Bab al-Mandab and the Suez Canal, and then towards southern Africa as well, that this route is protected. China knows that because of several reasons, not least political ones, there are dangers on this route, and it tried to find other routes, mainly via land routes, which include the Pakistan corridor, and on the other side it's the Myanmar corridor and the line which crosses from Myanmar over to Sri Lanka and to the center of the Indian Ocean. Now that's the strategic starting point. What is China doing then? With its Belt and Road Initiative, it has actually tried to do the very same in the maritime sector as well, which is not really linked to the BRI initiatives. It's just the integration of China's strategic interests into this overall concept. If you look at the outcome today, 40% roughly of global shipments are in Chinese hands, and more than 50% of the global top 100 harbors of the world are held or managed by the Chinese. So that's an incredible efficiency. With this strategy, of course, China has obtained certain impact. It has a very solid neighborship strategy with the Pakistan corridor and Burma or Myanmar corridor, and a special situation in Sri Lanka with the two large harbors in Hambantota and Colombo. It has created a situation which de facto meant that China is surrounded, and that the balance in Asia has been tipped quite decisively. What is even more important is the Chinese intentions in the southern Chinese Sea. This is more or less the sea surface which they intend to control. And if you take the southernmost point, it means that all of South Asia is actually within immediate reach for China. So their reach has been considerably increased, with a considerable influence also on the military situation. And this is also a big strategic influence, because it is the connection between the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean, we only have these islands there in between, and so it's of big strategic importance to make sure that this transition between the two oceans can be controlled. It is for this reason that this question is the biggest priority for China, also because currently China feels a bit limited. China has always been a terrestrial power, except maybe 500 years ago. It has never been a maritime power, or a sea power, and it is now trying to compensate this disadvantage with its strategy, which is directed towards the south on the one hand and also towards the open Pacific, crossing the insular area. It's quite interesting to see or to take a look at the cyber card, the cyber map, the internet cables which cross the South Chinese Sea. And so if you have strategic control of this area, you can control the entire flow of information between Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, or at least the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, if you consider the topics of strategy and will, and want to look at the main elements of the Chinese strategy, you can say it's a Sino-centric structure, Qian-Xia, everything on the sky. You can define it whatever way you want to. This is what the party leadership has determined, and China has the goal to be the world power in the world in economic, political and military terms. They have this territorial strategy, but of course the main focus is on being the leading economic power. If you look at strategy and will, of course, you also have to look at China's preconditions for achieving this. Well, there's a central formation of the will in China, top-down process. The party leader takes a decision and the nation will follow. And then China, based on its special constellation, can also engage in long-term planning. Xi Jinping has been elected for life, so he will not have to face the voters again. He can develop long-term strategies. And China also has the possibility to use comprehensive resources. More than any other nation, China can use all of its state resources, but also 90% of national funds for its own strategic goals. The basis of this are a few facts such as its population structure. Of course, there are some weaknesses. The West, with Tibet and the Xinjiang province, will still remain potential weak points in the next decades or so. But on the other hand, 90% of China's population are Han Chinese. So they build a uniform population, something none of the other players can avail of. And this means that nationalism and the formation of a national will, irrespective of a specific personality, are quite a strong factor. So this basically says it all. Where do we have the weaknesses, the minorities to the west of the country? Then we have another weakness maybe as regards very successful Chinese states outside of the Chinese territory. First and foremost, Singapore, of course, which is the most successful example. which is actually a Chinese state outside of the immediate Chinese zone, but also Taiwan and Hong Kong can have an influence on the system. When they will be able to exert this influence on a short term is unsure, because the success of the current system is so recent. It only goes back 30 years or so. In 1987, Deng Xiaoping gave the green light, which actually determined the transition to a market-based system, and it started such a big dynamic in economic development that they could create the preconditions of a world power status and absolute dominance. I often say that we Europeans consider 1989 the big transition year. In the long run, it probably will remain an anecdote. It took 40 or 50 years to end the Cold War, but in 1987, that was when China entered the world economic system, and this changed China's position and the position of all the other world players in a decisive manner, and this will have an impact for more than 40 or 50 years, probably for hundreds of years, and this is probably the turning point in history. Should not forget that. Now let's move on. What will we see in the future? The maritime influence will probably be extended maybe up to the 180th degree. You will not find this in any written papers, but in discussions with Chinese generals, it's something which turns up every now and then, and it's been mentioned also in the Austrian military newspaper a few years ago.
Now let's take a look at America. Well, the US is still the only true global power, and what's interesting is that the US has not only the claim to being a global power, but it also has a very traditional security system, a counter-rim strategy. That has been the reason why NATO was set up. So from the North Cap all the way to Sicily, that was counter-rim strategy. Containment of Russia, the Soviet Union was just a side effect. And since much of the territory was occupied, they tried to conquer Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and also Asia. So that was the strategy that tries to conquer the counter-rim. So it's a logical concept for any maritime superpower. What's special about it is that, of course, by doing that, and since China rose to power, this American security concept on the Pacific side was increasingly questioned and being fragmented, and this was a clash of national interests that automatically ensued. Now let us take a look at the map of US military bases. So we can see that they have a global presence, and there is a overweight in this region. And what this shows to me is that it hasn't been possible yet to redirect the American strategy to reflect the new requirements. Actually, the greatest challenge is China, and actually the Americans, all the important civil and military authorities should have a never-ending discussion. What can we do in order to stay ahead? Because there's no doubt that the American concept isn't, or the American strategy is not to go under, but to preserve its hegemonial position. So, that's the main question that needs to be addressed. And if you're faced with such a challenge, then you need to be fully focused on that task. And in reality, in my mind, well, there's one map missing, but never mind. So America has maybe dithered for 1.5 decades. So they lost this time because they didn't have a strategic focus. So America has 3 opponents, 3 declared opponents: China, Russia, and Iran. And actually the only real opponent that counts is China. Well, we still talk about Russia because it's the only existential threat on the basis of the nuclear capacities, about 6,000 nuclear warheads on both sides. But anyway, this neglecting of priorities is actually one of the major weaknesses that we are seeing in the American strategy. And that is maybe due to historical conditions as well as domestic American conditions. Now, let us take a look forward. How will this play out? So what we are seeing is the development of GDP, the blue line representing the US. Do we see that China is already passing America? It has passed America, has left it behind, even with purchasing power parity. And you see that the yellow line is India. Now, red being China. So the current function that politically, economically and militarily that the US is the strongest power, this is slowly reaching an end. And that's the big issue that needs to be discussed. And we have to say that in terms of the priorities and the objectives, Trump is right in starting an economic war with China. Not that this might be something that he desires, but if America wants to preserve its status, then it can only do so, I guess, if it is capable of not really getting too far away from China, economically speaking. They need this proximity because otherwise this might have a military impact. So these are different projections, of course, but to put it in simple terms, everybody assumes that in 2040 at the latest, China will exceed the US in terms of military spending in a long lasting and enduring way on account of its economic strength. So that's the current perspective. I'm not going to go into detail. America is clearly the dominant power, not in terms of personnel, but in terms of the impact, in terms of the technology, etc. What's interesting, if you look at this next chart, that's the structure of US defense spending. Orange is personnel cost, blue emissions, so the operations, deployments, and in green you see the investments, and dark green part, that's the nuclear component. So you can see how high the share of the operations budget is in the American total military spending budget. So if you take out the operations, then The American budget is like 600 million and 200 billion for China, so it's not so much ahead, because half of the money goes into operations. It's not all money lost, of course, because this means that America has a great training and deployment of operations advantage, a competence that nobody else has. But anyway, this means that technological progress depends on spending, of course, and it doesn't reach as far as one might believe at a first glance. Now, what's essential about the American strategy is, like I said, the lack of strategic priorities. Now, unless America tries to focus on its main opponent, and if it doesn't bundle all of its forces and all of its attention on China, then it's probably not going to win. It's not going to prevail. Only if, bearing in mind the economic considerations and economic dynamism, if they can focus on this one opponent, can they keep the equilibrium? And that, of course, has a big impact and significance. And I'm not going to talk about many of these individual aspects, but it's a lack of priorities, and it's the loss of economic power. It's this inner isolationism that comes up time again. This has historical roots, of course, but currently it's quite strong. And it's the political polarization. The political polarization within America, there are two camps that make it impossible to have a long-term strategy focus and to thus decisively influence the national strategic will. That's the essential point, and America needs to address this and needs to overcome this problem. Whether they will be doing that successfully, we can't say. We can only wish for them to do that. Now I'd like to conclude this one point and move on to the next major strategic power, not a global power, but a superpower. But it's still an important power. And this shows 500 years of Russian geopolitics, from the Grand Duchy of Moscow, then all the way to the conquering of Eurasia. What you see in yellow is everything that was conquered after 1700. If you look at this map, it is interesting to see that, with the exception of the Far East, the areas shaded in yellow, so everything that Russia conquered after 1700 was lost. So Finland was the first to go after the First World War, but also Eastern Europe, the Caucasian, and Central Asia. We see a lot of independent states today. Now, this is an indication of the fact that power of integration has not been sufficient to keep countries that had been conquered. But in terms of the Russian strategy, it is undoubtedly the case that the entire strategy was aiming at conquering back this Russian empire, at least in terms of substantial parts of this empire being integrated or being dominant in other parts of this former empire without letting anybody else in, such as in Central Asia. Now, what this means is, let me show you a couple of pictures before I get to that. So, Russia wants to dominate the Russian world, of course, but it also has a more far-reaching strategy. So between China and the West, they want to build up a group of states that are an intermediate category of countries that are relatively independent of China and independent of America. So that's the Middle East, and that's also upkeeping the historically good relations with India, which is of course more difficult because the relationship on the interests of India have changed significantly, but also a strong presence in North Africa. You can already see the activities, no matter whether it's in Egypt, Sudan, or other countries. So there are attempts to build up not really a bloc, but independent states that are neither dominated by China nor by the West. But this takes on a secondary priority. The main priority consists in dominating or maintaining the Russian world. Now, if we ask ourselves the question how will and strategy are linked, let me show you a map on that. That's the picture of the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula here. You see in color all the places where Russian soldiers are stationed and deployed in Transnistria, in the Crimean, Donetsk, Luhansk, southern Ossetia, and Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now, what results from this is, on the one hand, is a garden fence, and I think this is quite intentional. So they want to control the northern half of the Black Sea and also the Caucasian region. And for Armenia and Azerbaijan, they are doing quite a good job, and in Georgia it's a bit different. And this based on the initiative of the United States. Now, if we take another look, so what's the relationship here between strategy and will? Well, in the case of Russia too, there is a unity of will. So the will forms the strategy. Actually, Russia has a couple of strengths: the size, the nuclear capacity, its wealth in raw materials, but also major weaknesses. The weak industry, the exports of Russia, quite apart from oil, is somewhere between Austria and Switzerland in terms of its exports. So just to show how weak this major nation is in terms of the economy. But what they have managed to do is use limited means and, well, implement part of their objectives at least, gradually. And this is good military strategy done by the president. And it's not only his own idea, but the entire Russian elite is behind the soldiers, diplomats, academics. They are all trained that way, and also the entire nation, as we've seen in the Middle East, the entire nation is ready to go along and to be pleased about this development. So this is a very close connection between strategy and will. Now this brings me to the next stakeholder. Let me get back to this picture, simply because I want to show, if you look at the Indo-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean, as an enormous strategic position that India holds in the region. It protrudes into the center of the Indian Ocean, and thus it plays a really important role and has an important function in this region. Now, what are India's strategic interests? Essentially in the maritime field, in Southeast Asia and on the African, Arabic coast, also in Western Asia, and also towards Central Asia. But the link is weakest here because Pakistan is in between and hampers the natural access of India to Central Asia. This now only works through Iran because Pakistan is the arch enemy on the Indian subcontinent. Thus, there are hardly any contacts there. Now, let's move on. What are the main weaknesses or the main problems? Those are maps that show the ethnic diversity and the language families, not the individual languages, and then there's different religions. There's Hindus, almost 200 million Muslims, and Sikhs, and Buddhists, and many other groups. And what this leads to is an enormous problem in terms of the forming of a common will, and also the link between strategy and will. So the location and the size form the strategic interest. The strength lies undoubtedly in demographic growth, but this fragmentation is so strong that in the case of India we have to assume that one of the main components of its policies is introversion. So the country is looking in upon itself and is hardly capable of bundling its forces and project them onto the outside world, because there are so many problems within the country. And thus, this is another chart. So if we were to draw a comparison in terms of the GDP of India and China, you can see that in 1990 both had next to nothing, so it was more or less the same. Now today, India has a lot more than back then, but China is about 5 times as large in terms of GDP. And even in the most favorable ways of representing this, of course, this distance is going to increase in future, even though India might catch up. That's a strength and weakness at the same time. The population, the demographics, again, compared to China, where you can see quite clearly the effect of the one-child policy. That used to be a benefit, and now it's increasingly a disadvantage. And on the other hand, the very balanced pyramid of India. India will be the most populous state, and in terms of its human capital, it has the biggest potential of all, and that will also be decisive to see whether they can mobilize this potential. But this potential exists on account of the large population size and on account of the strategic ambitions. That's the conflict between aims and means. We have large goals, but not really the means to reach them. And the problem of this introversion, this introvertedness. Now, this brings me to the last player. Yes, this picture. India has no other choice than to try to overcome these weaknesses by intensive cooperation. So, intensive cooperation with Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington. So, they call it the Quad. So this quadruple alliance, so India is refusing to talk about an alliance because it has a strong tradition of being independent, but actually this cooperation is getting stronger every day, and I think it is just masked. So this is, of course, from the point of view of America, a possibility to find a partner in Asia who is capable of giving it additional strength and to compensate for some weaknesses. This brings us to the last point, the European Union. That is the picture of the European security architecture. In purple, you see the EU. That's the countries that are with EU and NATO. In blue, you see the EU countries only. So Finland, Sweden, Austria, and Ireland. And then there's the NATO members only, Iceland, Norway, and Albania. Then Montenegro will be added, and Turkey. Now, what this shows is the difficulties of Europe. What we see here, that it's not only about an alliance of nations, more than 30 countries, I think it's 33 countries in the whole that belong to those two blocks. But there's also a security policy split between the EU and NATO, and primarily NATO. That has, of course, a consequence at the foreign policy side. And Turkey, as one of the most important NATO countries, is now excluded for the near future to access the European Union. Now, if we ask ourselves the question, how well has the EU succeeded so far to stabilize this environment? So there's the Eastern Partnership, there's the Southern Partnership, and if we take a look at those areas, Eastern Europe is seen as one problem area, and Northern Africa as another problem zone, and the Middle East. So these are the three regions bordering on Europe. Well, in Eastern Europe, as far as Ukraine is concerned, the European Union is only ranked second after the US, but it plays an important role. Northern Africa, so far, we have not really succeeded in stabilizing this very well. We can say that without exaggeration. In the Middle East, the EU simply is not there. There's no presence of the EU there. So we are confronted with the situation where this foreign policy success is moderate, and the EU as a global power, well, doesn't really have a big power. Where does it have power? Well, actually, almost only among those countries that want to join the European Union. That's where the EU serves as a big power, because it can help shape or influence or control the development of those countries that want to exceed. In the other countries, that isn't the case. And the further away you move from Europe, the lower the influence. There are various causes for that, and this is not only due to the fact that in Europe there are 33 countries, but this is also due to the fact that there are different groups of countries, Mediterranean countries, the Eastern European, the Northern Anglo-Saxon, and the Central Western European group of countries. It's quite interesting to look at these groups of countries. This is another map that's about 7 or 8 years old, but about 100 million people living here, and in the center there's about 200 million inhabitants. So in terms of population size, this is also the center, the central western region. So this is something we need to deal with more intensively than anything else. Also in the central region, in terms of partnership between Germany and France, it is not only that France, Germany, together with Great Britain, have played a leading role in the past, but also in terms of security policy, there is no common will. Quite the opposite. We see a clash of civilizations. This is a post-colonial interventionist France that is clashing with a pacifist Germany. And any European policy can only be developed if we can manage to overcome this opposition. And that is the main task, no matter what Poland or Italy or whoever may think. But if we can't really bring Germany and France on a common denominator, then there is no chance to form a strategic will or to reach the targets. So only a few days ago, the decision for a joint successor project to Rafale and Eurofighter, so an armament project that Germany and France will be sponsoring jointly. So this is seen as a central armament project, and this is of central importance for the future and the possibility to make progress in this direction. So, like I said, this is the map of the Iron Curtain, the former Iron Curtain that fell, and thus we grew to the east by 1,500 kilometers. On the other hand, you see this important significance of Ukraine, strategically speaking for Russia, but also for Europe. And already in the 90s, I kept saying, without Ukraine, Russia cannot be invaded, and in future this will apply to a greater extent. And this is why it is of central importance, and whether the EU deals with it as a central question, I don't know whether I can answer this with a clear yes. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my presentation. The problem is that there are different perceptions of threat, and resulting from that, we have diverging or no policies. There's a high perception of threat in the northern Baltic states and in Poland, and a low or non-existent perception of threat in the south. And you can assess yourself how difficult it is in such a situation to deal with these different interests and apathy in the Mediterranean region to come up with a strong common policy. Now let's briefly. So a question that Europe will be dealing with is certainly Africa. You see the development of the demographics, and those are the forecasts coming from the UN statistics. By 2100, they estimated to be 4.5 billion. But I have used these old figures the way it was forecast back then. All of Africa, less than 200 million inhabitants in 1950. Now it has 1.2 billion, and in 2050 it will double to 2.4 billion, and at the end of the century it will almost double again to 4.5 billion. What results from that is, without any doubt, demographics as a problem, but on the other hand also demographics as an opportunity for economic growth. And we're not using any of these opportunities. So the question is, where is Europe strong? That's where also the competition is strong in the Balkans, and in particular Russia, but also others such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia are trying to gain influence. It's about the successor states of the Western Balkans. The question of integration is, of course, a very important question that needs to be addressed, because one thing's for sure: if this integration happens too quickly, there will not only be no incentive for rapprochement, and there will also be an automatic loss of depth of integration, and thus lose in strength. So it's a difficult question. It's hard to address, but of course there's a certain understanding that this is what we should be doing. Now, this takes me to my last slide, which shows the European investments of EU countries in China from 2000. And this also shows the red curve, the investments of China in Europe. And what you're seeing here, that isn't a matter of behavior that is in conformity with the markets, but this goes to show how strong the strategic will is to also dominate in the economic realm comes to bear. So Europe has started very early. In 2013, this curve of investments in China went up dramatically, and the question whether this should be controlled, whether there's a strategic dimension to that, came up last year when the Chinese bought KUKA, the main robot manufacturing plant in Europe. But of course, this could already be anticipated, and after this outcry that came in Europe, this number went down significantly from one day to the next. And this goes to show that there's an interaction between state and private interventions. And this is the last slide for my presentation, because I wanted to show with this picture that Europe will have to define itself based on China. It's not the past, it's not the French-German equalization, or it is not a special project of any kind, but in reality it is only the challenge that comes from China that can and will partially lead to Europe having to undertake major efforts in the area of strategy, that it will try to develop a joint will in order to implement its strategies, because hitherto this has hardly been the case. So this is why I have this quote here: if there is the intention but the will to act is missing, then the will is null and void. So will covers everything: the analysis, it covers the forming of alternatives, the decision-making process, and the decision to act. Anything else is just null and void, or a paper tiger. And that is the great challenge for Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Die Zeit habe ich zur Gänze in Anspruch genommen.
I can see that you used up all my time, and I thank you for your virtual questions.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Herr Bundesminister.
Thank you very much,
Und
Minister.
aufgrund der fortgeschrittenen Zeit, meine sehr geschätzten Damen
As
und
it's
Herren,
run
möchte ich
quite
nun
late, ladies and
sofort
gentlemen, let me
überleiten zum nächsten
immediately
Vortragenden zum
move on
Thema
to our
Strategie
next
und Wille,
presentation
Analogiebildung,
on
Deutscher
strategy
Bund und
and
EU,
will
am
analogy,
Beispiel des Krieges von
German Confederation and EU based on the example of the wars of 1866 in southwest Germany.
Oberstleutnant der Reserve, Oberregierungsrat Dr. Eberhard
Lieutenant
BIRK,
Colonel of the Reserve,
an der
Dr.
Offiziersschule
BIRK, will
der
present this topic to
Luftwaffe.
us. He is lecturer at the German Air Force
sehr.
Officer Training School.
Herr Dozent Dr. BIRK,
Dr. BIRK,
darf sagen,
the floor is
the
yours.
floor is yours. Und jawohl.
Mit?
Ja, mit dem. Ja, ja, schon. Jawohl.
Gut. Ist das Ding hier an? Ist meine Präsentation? Bitte? Ja, klar. So, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this kind introduction and for having me invited to the 4th Vienna Strategy Conference as well. Vienna has been a center of politics with many internal and external fronts over the centuries, good ones and bad ones, if allowed to use this category. Whether the right strategy was here used, whether the objectives were too ambitious with regards to the available resources, that depends on the viewpoint. Looking at it from a neutral point of view, the stamina of the Habsburgs over the centuries suggests that the will to maintain this power must have been immense. And I think most of you would probably agree that if the EU managed to last at least half or 1/3 of the time of the Habsburgs, it will be very successful. Vienna seems to be the right place to talk about the topics of strategy and will. I like to be here. My grandmother was born in Vienna, and Rudolf of Habsburg, the first Habsburg, made his son, who was born outside marriage, Count of Löwenstein, my hometown, and two residents of my hometown left their mark in Vienna. One was an artist who was involved in the design of Maria Theresia's statue between the Museum of History and Museum of Natural Science, and the second one created a famous clock on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of Maria Theresia's reign. Strategy and will. It's a very wide-ranging topic, and it requires a lot of confidence to be talking about this. And of course, it's very difficult to cope with this topic, because on the one hand, it's very small, it's banal. You should always assume that people acting strategically have a strategic will and formulate this will. On the other hand, it's a very big topic if you really want to look at it in all its ramifications, because this would probably mean that we'd have to retreat to the study room for quite some time, and so therefore it's necessary for me to shorten my talk and focus on some priorities. Let me start with two quotes. The first one is a quote of the Grand Master of Diplomacy, 96-year-old Henry Kissinger, who said, "In 1914 there was a strategy but no policy. In 1939 there was a policy but no strategy." The second quote is taken from a speech of the first General Inspector of the Federal Armed Forces, General Adolf Heusinger, who spoke on the role of the General Staff officers in the present time and in the future. And he said, "Mind without will is worthless, will without mind is dangerous." You could say that based on his earlier function as chief of the operations department of the High Command of the German Army between 1940 and 1944, he knew what he was talking about. These quotes, for me, are a reminder of the fact that in this field we always have to try to have clear definitions and have to use our historical context, because setting a strategy without knowledge of the past and the political framework conditions would lead you to theoretical discussions and to sort of nirvana. We therefore have to consider both concepts. Strategy and will in a broader sense. Will includes the mind, and strategy always includes meaningful policy, which, in spite of present, is always based on the experience of the past. I don't claim to be able to provide clear definitions. We have seen many great minds who studied political, military, and philosophical aspects of these topics. Will without mind can turn into furor. Strategy without mind can result in targeted actions, but will only be the execution of an arbitrary purpose. Now, enough with the introduction. I've been asked to provide examples from military history. So first of all, I want to introduce you to terms strategy and will. And we have to be aware of the fact that, depending on one's viewpoint, there are, of course, manifold ways to approach the topic. I therefore decided to try and find an approach which will fit with the objectives of this conference. And then I will take a look at the past to give a cautionary example, which can also be seen as a pessimistic description of the current security situation in Europe. Let me start with the concept of strategy. It seems easier to me because it's the bread and butter of a teacher of military history, at least in part. Strategy, the term, has goes a long way back. I don't want to look at the details. We have enough experts here, and the proceedings of the 3 previous conferences will include several essays on this topic. But the increasing complexity in this area can be reminded by looking at the main stages of strategy, the development of strategy, which can be attributed to the advancement of civilization over time and a reaction to constantly changing influencing factors in politics, society, the economy, and technology. In the antiquity, strategy was only referring to warfare, but there can also be found examples of today's strategy. Think of Alexander's campaign, but also of the Romans, who without a strategy which was changing would never have been able to build and maintain such a long-lasting empire. So it comes as no surprise that strategies at a later time would turn back to antiquity to study strategy. It's also a foundation of our educational system, and written sources of that era illustrate many perfect examples of strategy. In the Napoleonic era, a new viewpoint started in this area. Clausewitz, who emphasized the use of combat for the purpose of war, also looked at the political dimension of war. In the 19th century, thinking about strategy was quite clearly reduced to military strategy, but after World War II, the term was broadened again. This is exemplified by the theoretical approaches of Little Hart in his Grand Strategy, André Boffre and Henry Kissinger, who consider strategy as a systematic way of thinking, which develops the term of strategy away from the military sphere. In the last 2 to 3 decades, strategy, the term of strategy, was becoming increasingly differentiated, including many different fields, and becoming a big structure. Everyone tried to give his share, which was sometimes to the detriment of clarity in the advice given to political decision makers. Decision makers, it is implied, should have a will. Whether this will is always focused on strategic aspects is something we assume, very often at least, but I don't know if the practitioners in the field would actually confirm this. Let me now turn to will. When we talk about will, and if we approach it from a theoretical point of view, the thing is a bit more different. It's a multifaceted notion, and it can also be found in various fields of science, sociology, law, and of course in psychology. Defining the term of will in a philosophical, psychological, legal way, that's something that's too limited for us. It's not about me, about how I feel, act, or how this has to be assessed in legal terms. It's also about the existence or achievement of objectives determined by political actors such as states or alliances. We should find a working definition which allows us to use the concept of strategy for our purposes. So the term mustn't be too undefined next to the strategy, the term of strategy. Will has to be a free will. It has to be irrespective of biological, chemical, or other limits. If we were to take this into consideration, then there wouldn't be responsibility to take for anything. And this is also true if will is the result of a long-lasting process of education, or, to put it negatively, of indoctrination. Will is always shaped by an innumerable amount of influencing factors. When formulating will, we have individual life experiences which play a role and which extend a strategic culture. This process of socialization of will has an effect on completely new situations as well. In general, will means in this area to be able to implement decisions in a sustainable and targeted way through consistent action. Will, therefore, and this is important for our topic here, will includes a creative aspect, the formulation of a goal. By doing this and followed by personal initiative, will differs from a wish which is fulfilled by other people or by chance. Will must not be equated with the hope of achieving a strategic goal. Also, refraining from taking action can actually be the expression of will. However, others may interpret this as a weakness of will, laziness, or lack of initiative. Also, when developing, formulating, and putting one's own will into action, one must always assume that an opposing will may actively and systematically attempt to undermine one's will, ideally and materially. The situation is especially critical when, first of all, this possibility is completely ignored, or secondly, the goals of the opponent's will are misinterpreted completely. The problem is made worse if both actors compete for one and the same thing, and so it's one will against another. As a consequence, goals set on the basis of one's will may be missed due to internal and external obstacles, which can result in frustration, resignation, general discouragement, but can also lead to new motivation and commitment. To overcome potential frictions by a new intellectual approach and renewed energy. Willpower is needed to overcome these obstacles in order to achieve a goal. For this, we need mental concentration and stamina. So it's important to believe in the strength of one's own will and work on it. In any case, to constantly question its validity in a critical and reflective way. What does this mean for our topic? Will is the source of all action. No action is possible without will, so it's the first step, and it has to be maintained during the action in order to obtain objectives. But it's like a black box because there are constant changes, and so strategy and will are not constant factors. Will, just as strategy, do not only need mind and intellect, but also the readiness to take on responsibility before action is taken and while it is implemented, but also once one has seen the consequences. All of this should be embedded in a strong self-image of a strong and competent actor. Will, strategy, decision, and responsibility therefore go hand in hand. Will aims at activity in order to set things in motion and keep them going internally and externally. As a rule, this should ensure freedom and achievement of one's own will, whereas the opponent should be kept from enforcing his own will. Will, therefore, has to be underpinned by commitment. It has to become effective in practice. Only if, as a consequence of will, actual resources are made available and actions are carried out, can this be credible. Without this, we cannot change the will of the others. Will is also a precondition of strategy, and it has to have the goal of breaking the opponent's will in such a way that the opponent is not made defenseless, because this may have unpleasant consequences at a later stage. Also, a gradual change can be one of the goals which may trigger a learning process in the opponent. To me, what's important is that we have a will, and this will is a precondition to existence and survival. This, however, requires material and intellectual resources more than anything. It's evident that this intellectual will has emerged as a function of many factors: the political system, historical experience, economic power, societal development, technological status, geographical position, and cultural conditions such as legitimation, self-image, ethos, and self-commitment such as political and strategic culture. They all play an important role for both will and strategy, which then hopefully can rely on comprehensive organizational structures and means, even though they should provide for the necessary flexibility in order to be able to react to the unknown. Will is not just a result of reacting to current challenges and objectives. It does not come out of nowhere and as a reaction of today's developments. It spans from the past to the present and to a set of goals projected into the future. Not only functional elites have to be taken along, but also the society as a whole. Now, of course, these two terms, strategy and will, have to be joined now. So independent of values, questions of legitimation and legitimacy, in the essence, the logical course of our overarching subject will look as follows. First of all, we need a clear political will, as a rule, at least the self-assertion of the agent alone or jointly with others. Secondly, the objective, which next to material and ideal benefits envisages a time horizon in the foreseeable future. Third, formulating a strategy which includes indispensable key features and negotiable elements. Fourth, the capability to mobilize material and intellectual resources in order to ensure credibility internally and the ability to act towards the outside. Fifth, establishing and maintaining functioning structures for the standard and crisis situations. And sixth, the ability to combine one's own resources in such a way that even in times of resistance they will lead to success, which means at least maintaining or optimizing the status quo or its achievement.
Of course, one might discuss whether it is not the case in reality. Basically, everything falls into one, usually without prioritization and the reactive character, because action always takes place in the present and has to cope with what's given. Now, if you want to continue with the strategy without adapting it, then failure will occur. Or maybe the strategy was wrong and turns out to be correct in the new environment, but this would be the confirmation of the sobering result that we already discussed on the occasion of prior meetings, namely the strategy deficit. Maybe I've been a bit abstract and esoteric, so let me now take a look at military history. This is more familiar terrain. So if based on the analysis of the past, you hope to help to overcome challenges in the present, you must be aware of the limitations. Knowing the boundary conditions of other eras and processes and events, but also the extrapolation of success and failure with respect to a positive or negative doctrinal value only makes sense if the earlier structures allow a comparison with today's situation. Now, they must not be seen as a recipe. Former President of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker, once put it like this: the spiritual confrontation with history offers people not education, but horizons. You don't learn from history what you should do, but you should learn what you should consider or have to consider. What you have to consider implicitly refers to what didn't work out, and often it is the failures that we learn most from. What should be considered for the goal of strengthening the will and strategy of the present Europe, no matter in political form, is a lesson that I came across when I was dealing with a soldier from my hometown. He was killed in action at Tauber-Bischofsheim in 1866, but it is not his death, but the political and structural background opened my eyes to the background. So let me now focus on the Southwest German war theater of 1866. So the Austrians shouldn't be worried that I would be talking about Königsgrätz. Now, to briefly put you back in what the situation was like back then. After the anti-Napoleonic wars, the Congress of Vienna drew up a new order of peace for Europe under the headings of restoration, legitimacy, and solidarity. Since none of the great powers could gain anything from the national idea, the German Confederation was conceived for the center of the continent. From the strategic point of view, the German Confederation was a union of states that had a defensive buffer function. One could, as this is occasionally seen, go so far as to say that the Bund formed a small Europe. Numerous large and medium-sized and smaller states, which together formed an alliance composed of more than 3 dozen sovereign member states. German Confederation maintained a peaceful coexistence within the country and was not a serious strategic actor for anybody outside it. So if we put the terms will and strategy to this object of investigation, we have to ask whether these were present and how they became effective. Now let's take a look at the war constitution of the German Confederation. To this end, it provided for the federal war on the outside in the case of defense and for federal wars of execution interventions on the inside. So an assembly was to be selected, and there were no plans to intervene in conflicts outside the Confederation in the larger European framework. So the armed forces consisted of 10 corps of professional soldiers. The first 7 corps were more or less nationally homogeneous. The 3 other corps were more or less a deliberate military reservoir to express the triad idea of the Third Germany. What appears to be constitutionally, politically, and militarily clearly structured quickly rubbed off in reality. After more than 30 years on the topic of politics and strategy of the German Confederation, we can see the following result. Insistence on national sovereignty rights, concentration on domestic stability and prosperity, trust in the peacefulness of the present and the future, shrinking provision of resources for contingency and a future of peace, a lack of resources, and nothing that made military sense. So a paralyzed will of shaping and doing anything in military terms. And for the German Confederation, the use of military force was inconceivable within the framework of a coalition. And this ultimately meant that the Confederation's self-assertion as a whole depended on all the coalition members. After the Crimean War of 1853 to 56, which also resulted in the German states waking up, a moderate arms race was set up. But this didn't lead to any substantial growth. There were too many special exceptions, numerous exemptions from duty for active soldiers, or people referred to a lack of funds. The regular inspection by teams of inspectors from other coalition states showed a disastrous picture. Except for the troops of Prussia and Austria, no army was ready for action. And there was an internal paralysis. The 2 great powers, Austria and Prussia, with their political dualism, prevented reforms from being carried out as a whole, and also jealousies between the medium and smaller powers that blocked each other. The consequence was the intensification of the dissolute operational readiness of most armies. Gradually, the 2 great powers headed towards the military solution of the German question and tried to rally the other members of the alliance around them. The German fratricidal war was then essentially a Prussian war of secession away from the German Confederation towards the spreading of Prussian power. More interesting than the course of the Bohemian region, which culminated in the Battle of Königgrätz, is the view of the behavior of Austria's allies. While the Saxons directly joined the troops of the imperial state, the 3 kingdoms of Hanover, Bavaria, and Württemberg formed the lead nations of the Federal Corps 7, 8, and 10, which remained in the German theater. Of course, the majority of the federal states had a political will to lean on Austrian big brother in the hope that they would win the war against the unpopular Prussians. Trusting in the Austrian strategic potency they had for decades previously let the troops shrink out of austerity, criminally disregarding new armament possibilities, and as the inner constitution of the German Confederation intended, trusted in the peaceful settlement of political conflicts, while Prussia focused on the change of military systems, railways, electric telegraphy, modern breech loaders, the Dreisig gun, and the infantry and powerful artillery guns, as well as the enforcement of general conscription. This incipient fratricidal war confronted the southwestern German states with the Prussian main army, which initially pushed back the Bavarian troops in several battles. The main line should be held, and if we take will and strategy as a basis, there was nothing. Only in the course of recognizing the violent execution of different political objectives, a coalition of the willing was supposed to form a common commander-in-chief. However, military strategy formation was blocked by different and diverging political goals. The military organization was a reflection of the organization and functioning of the political framework. Each actor distrusted the other in the same alliance. Solidarity within this alliance was always the task of the coalition partners. The Bavarians did not want to bow to a supreme command because they saw themselves as an independent middle power, and their chief of general staff rejected a German fratricidal war in principle. And the people in Baden didn't want a war at all because their Lord Mayor had served as a Prussian officer for many years. So it was not surprising that there was no strategic baseline and a non-existent will, which could have reflected in a joint operational plan. And added to this, almost every national commander of the various divisions had directives from their monarch in their marching orders. And the troops were to be immediately detached from the corps once their own political objectives were at risk. And this was quite simple at the War of Königgrätz, avoidance of the battle, since the preservation of the troops was a prerequisite for peace negotiations until the will without intellect broke through. At Tauber-Bischofsheim in Baden, south of the River Main, the 8th Federal Corps with its troops from Württemberg, Baden, Hesse and Nassau took up positions. Lord Mayor, Prince Alexander of Hesse, had previously been in Habsburg services and had received his function only after weeks of negotiations. He assumed far too optimistically that the Bavarians would support as promised, but they did not come after a series of partial defeats against the Prussians. The Baden division was to stand north of the Württemberger, but left its position during the beginning battle without reporting to the supreme commander. So the Württembergers stood alone and did not let the Prussians attack uphill from an ideal defensive position, but started 5 times down the hill with their senseless attacks, with their muzzle-loading rifles that the Prussians had already begun to introduce 20 years earlier. And after all, a higher sequence of shots would require more ammunition, that would cost more money. So the Württemberg attacks were, of course, rejected 5 times by the Prussians with their rifle without any problems. So my relative from Löwenstein was also among those fallen. The chief of the general staff of the Württemberg troops who ordered the attacks was the stepbrother of the king, so he couldn't hold him to account. And in the end, they covered, they retreated, and you see, will in a hopeless situation can become furor. Only when he was told that it was not appropriate to shoot the city of an ally into the ground, he abandoned his plan. So, all things told, the War of 1866 in the South German theater was a logical culmination of a catastrophe of all the omissions in the political and military terrain over 5 decades at all levels, all the way down to leadership behavior in combat. Now, what does this example show us? If you want to draw a comparison with the European present, which aims at conclusions, I think that many of the points read as a treatise on the current state of European defense policy. First of all, we have to say that this comparison is not really quite apt because, like most comparisons, when we talk about Europe, we have to take into account there are 2 different ones, one after the Second World War and one after the end of the Cold War. The continuity of the basic principle of a structural comparison remains intact, however. So both the German Confederation and also the reunification of the European states took place after a devastating war. They should serve peaceful development and help overcome the nation-state. They relied on the rule of law, settlement of internal conflicts, and on an exemplary political will to the outside. They bet on politics and diplomacy and reduced the size and quality of their armed forces in order to collect their peace dividend. Now, if we make a comparison with the Europe of the present, they failed for too long to adapt the new possibilities created by technological and economic change. And while some powers around the Confederation promoted the professionalization of their armies and aimed at political power shifts, the overwhelming majority of the members of the Confederation remained in lethargic passivity. Now, the political strategy was the hope that there would be no war, and if there would be, then we should rely on the big brother. But you know, the political and military will to play for time is not always effective. Interestingly, however, all the middle and small powers endeavored to follow the signs of the time in the economic sphere. where the German Customs Association had been setting the course of the future since 1834. But historical perspective also teaches us that this economic interdependence is no guarantee for a peaceful development of the future, because this was more or less the case in the past without this having prevented wars. Otherwise, I would be unemployed as a military history teacher. Now, what are the conclusions that can be drawn for the present? Now, I have presented this depressing negative example. I had to capitulate in front of this question. Scientists can present analysis, knowing more or less about the facts of the past in terms of success or failure. They can relate current frameworks and maybe relate this to the past. And if historians and political scientists or engaged citizens are available, they can also make forecasts for the future. But they're in a comfortable situation because they don't bear the responsibility, because this is indivisibly in the hand of those actors who, of course, need to reassert themselves, and they also need a will to shape and to act, and they also need to answer that before their consciences. So every responsible person, regardless of the terrain of strategy, cannot escape this obligation to deal with the matter themselves. The sooner the better. For time reasons, I will skip a couple of pages, and I will continue and conclude with the hope that the next speaker, starting tomorrow, will help us maybe to find a master strategy that will show the way forward to a livable future. But I hope, I fear, and I hope that we will meet many times again here in Vienna at such conferences. And thus I would like to conclude my presentation and thank you for having stayed with us for a long time. It's relatively late. Thank you.
Lieber Eberhard, herzlichen Dank für den hervorragenden Vortrag.
Thank you very much for this excellent speech. We always ask Dr. BIRK to speak on the first day because he has talent to make a structural presentation about a broad topic, to look at all the preconditions and basic approaches, and then really create the perfect basis for discussion. You have again succeeded in this in an excellent way, and I'm quite sure that we will have a few questions, which I would now like to ask you very briefly. We have time for 2 or 3 questions before Dr. Fleck will join us from the parallel event in a few minutes. Your questions, please. And please use a microphone so you can be interpreted.
Danke für Ihre Ausführungen. Sie haben interessant gesagt, das Jahr 1866.
Thank you for your speech. You said 1866 was the year of the secession war of the Prussians from the German Confederation. In the end, you said you could not give an answer, but the previous speaker gave it already. He said the French were involved in one war after the other for the last 70 years in colonial wars, and he said Germany is becoming increasingly pacifist. I think this is the solution for the future. My question is the following: will the EU end in the same way as the German Confederation? Question, please.
Okay.
Well, Colonel, to get a question from you was a foregone conclusion. Well, the thing is, I found a lot of similarities, not only in terms of Germany, but also in terms of Europe. What will happen in 2112, whether NATO will still be around? Of course, Austria will still be around. They will be around forever, but we can't really gaze into the crystal ball deep enough to see whether the others will still be around. But, of course, we have seen a lot of comparable situations in terms of foreign policies, security policies at the day and age of the German Confederation, and then there was the Crimean War. So maybe there will be another 10 years ahead of us. But let me warn you that we should not really make draw conclusions for the present. Now, the French have a different strategic culture than the Germans. It's clear, but I don't know whether we can find anybody who would engage in post-colonial wars and then say maybe Namibia should think back of its roots more than 100 years ago. No, we won't do that. So the French have a different approach. We are happy as Germans that we're rid of our colonies through Versailles. And so we went in a completely different direction. That's another drama in the German military history. But to make a forecast whether the European Union will decide or will fail like the German Confederation, I don't know. The Kaiserreich, the empire of the Kaiser, well, it was different. But there's analogies. There's the customs union. Everybody participates, and this is like a preparation of nation states. But back then, everybody spoke German, and the European Union, with its 28 member states and 24 different official languages, or 23, well, it's going to take longer. And the Germans got together through a war, and we don't want rapprochement through war, but a closer cohesion. And as Minister FASSLABEND said, the Austrians, the Germans, well, not enough. So in the coming 20, 30, 40 years, people will not really have a lot of respect with respect to the Europeans, militarily speaking. But anyway, either you have a strong negative federator, so maybe a dark power looming somewhere on the horizon, or maybe the financial resources are so scarce that we need to move closer together, or there's a charismatic Führer that everybody would distrust. Not the former Führer, of course, but maybe a strong, charismatic leader who would give the impetus for us moving closer together. But a negative federator from the outside, I don't see that for Europeans. The financial means are not so scarce yet that we need to pool our resources for a European army, the way they should be led. And the charismatic leader, well, there's always the question in a democracy. And fortunately, we have a lot of democracies. So in Germany, until maybe a few weeks ago, Monsieur Macron was hyped as the European visionary, but now his country is cutting down to size. So I hope that we are going in the direction of Europe, also for my children and grandchildren, because it's the only way forward. But we need a little bit of brain and intellect and strategic thinker. But I don't know who said that when we talk about future air combat systems. Well, I work also with the Air Force and have a certain technical affinity. Of course, you need to get the planes up and then down in a controlled fashion. But if we only base ourselves on these weapon systems, well, we train the people for a certain thing. And then the question is, for what strategy do I need the Air Force? So I think the weapons system should come after the strategy. And of course, when it comes to technology development, we start on the weapon system first, but we need to know where we want to go. So we should know this first, and not just say, start with this project, because wherever you may go may be the wrong one. So, but I'm a teacher of military history. I look back at what didn't work in the past, and other presentations will be showing us what might not work in future. But what I don't want to see is that in 2049, the time will come when China will be number one, and we will all think, why didn't we tell our kids to learn Chinese rather than English? But I'm too much rooted in the West, so I don't want it to happen. So the Europeans should get together, but that's maybe a meeting or a conference of its own to discuss this. So the last keyword has unfortunately been a sad one. Eurofighters collided in Germany. One pilot, I think, survived. Of the other one, we don't know. We can only hope for the comrades from the Air Force that they both survived, but we don't really know any details. General, so I'd like to report that we've ended the first day. I would like to politely ask you, after maybe 1 minute that we need, to start with your final address for the day.